We missed the first couple of minutes of the sermon due to a technical glitch, so we're picking up just a little bit after we got started, but you should be okay, and we're glad you're listening today. Unmute. There we go. Sorry, Zoe. So you all can't see this, but I can see what's going on online right up there. And Zoe was good enough to pipe in and say, there's no sound, because I hit the mute button. Technology. So through baptism, we are brought into the family. We are brought into the family no longer as slaves, but as heirs. That we are brought into the family no longer bound to the power and control of sin in our lives, but to live them free as God has created us to be. As heirs, that changes the way that we see the world. It has to. It has to change the way that we see the world. We can't continue to view the world in the same way after baptism as we did before that, or at least we have to try. So the good thing about the Christian faith is that we don't have to be perfect at this. We don't have to pass with a 90%. We just have to try. We have to work on it. We have to be working in that direction. Because God knows that we are always going to struggle with this. It's always going to be a challenge for us because that's just a part of the world that we live in. That's just a part of the world that everyone lives in. It's not that it's harder for Christians because we recognize it. We're better off because we do recognize it. Most everyone else is like, we don't know. So we can know and we can work in that direction. And we're never going to be perfect at it, but we can get there. We can work in that direction. And that way of thinking and living is building on the things that we have been talking about now for several weeks. Even before we started this series, we go all the way back to Christ the King Sunday. So this would have been before Advent started, before Christmas got here, back when we were all still full of turkey and not pancakes. And we started that Sunday talking about Jesus as King. Not just as King, but King of all creation. And this changes the way that we see the world. And it's the key to that. So what does that actually look like? Think about it in this way. This is a couple of different ways this morning of different imagery that sticks in my mind so that I can better figure this out and better understand this. And this first one is based on an African American spiritual. It's one that I've sung many times. It's one that normally gets relegated to like children's choirs and children's music and VBS because it's a wonderful image, but it's very simple music. It appears to be very simple theology, and I'll admit at one point in time I was one of those folks that was a part of that, but I love this imagery, and it's hitting home for me and helping to describe this in a wonderful way. And it's this one that goes, he's got the whole world in his hands, he's got the whole world in his hands, he's got the whole world in his hands, he's got the whole world in his hands. Now, I love that imagery. Hold on to that imagery because this is where we begin to get things mixed up a little bit. Because we have to take this seriously, deeply seriously, and believe with our whole hearts that Jesus is King and that God has the whole world in his hands, because that changes everything. If we say that Jesus is King and that God holds the world in this way, then what does it mean to be president or governor or mayor? What does it mean to be a parent or a teacher? What does it mean to be a boss? What does it mean to be in charge of something then if we take that seriously? This is where things begin to shift. Before sin entered the world, Adam and Eve lived in the garden and it was great. There was no leader. There was no one who was in charge. There didn't have to be. They were equals in the garden because they knew God. How could you be in charge of something when you literally know that God is walking around there in that same place with you? And this was what was so very insidious about what the snake did when it tempted Adam and Eve. Because it wasn't that they broke the command that God gave them. One rule. They had one rule they had to follow. Don't eat the fruit. Snake tempted them and they ate the fruit. It wasn't just that they broke that one rule. That was bad enough. But now they became aware that you could be broken. Now they became aware that things can be different, that there are in fact differences between them. They became aware that if something was different, apparently it was wrong, and we can know that because what's the first thing they did? They eat their fruit, their eyes are opened up, and they go to find fig leaves to cover themselves up. They're saying, we're different now. That's a bad thing. They were different from each other. And that difference, knowing that things can be different, then becomes a source of conflict. Ever since that time, there have been arguments. There's been conflicts and fights and wars over differences. Because what happens is that, we know that you can be broken. We know that we all have differences now, and we recognize that there are those things. Well, we don't want to be broken, so obviously we're the ones that are right. Because our differences are okay. That means we're right. That means we're good. That means everyone else is wrong. The problem with that is that there's a lot of other people out there that are thinking the exact same thing. And so it's no surprise then when conflict breaks out, when things escalate. What does it mean then to say that God has the whole world in his hands? It's a new way to navigate those differences that doesn't place the power on being different. Now here's where we also have to be careful, because the next step in this, which is not a bad step, it just doesn't take us nearly as far as we think it does, is to say that, well, if we know that things are going to be different and that we're going to be different, then, well, let's just treat everyone the same and treat everyone equally. That's going to fix the problem, right? I said it's better. But the problem is you're still saying, we know we're all different, and we know all of those differences are really important, and that those differences are sources of conflict, so we're just going to treat everyone the same. That's not peace. That's not all the way there. That's just a ceasefire. That's just got us one step a little bit closer into things. That's not God's intent. So what is it that God wants from us? What do we do? We can't get away from differences and the divisions that come from that. We live in a world that is full of those things. And God's response to our differences is, I know. God said, I had 7 days of creation. I rested on one of them, and I created all of creation and everything that was different about it in 6 other days. I know that there are differences around here. That's okay. And all of those differences existed in the garden too, on a smaller scale. They existed there too. And so they've always been a part of us. But in the garden, they didn't have power. They weren't the things that were controlling. Because until they were tempted and they chose to eat from the fruit, they knew, Adam and Eve knew that they were created by God, that they were created in God's image. Yes, they were different from one another, but that was okay. That wasn't of any concern to them. Because they knew that God created them to be together. God was the source of their power, and everything else could work because of that. And so that's where we want to head back to. Now, we can't get all the way back to the garden because there is all of human history between the garden and where we finally get all of this figured out. But that process of getting to that new place where we don't let that power of that difference, that sin, control us is redemption. That's what we're searching for. That place where our differences and our divisions no longer control us. That we recognize them, we see those things for what they are, which is that God created us differently, but we are all still God's. And therefore, all of our jockeying for positions and power and control because we're right has no place. And that works because we aren't actually the ones who are in control. We aren't the ones in power. The writer of Colossians puts it this way. The peace of Christ must control your hearts, a peace into which you are called in one body, and be thankful people. That's the peace that we're after. That only comes when we let go of the search for control and power that lets differences and divisions control us. This is a peace that says we are in God's hands, that Jesus is our King, and could even be characterized by the phrase, whatever will be, will be. Now that's not strictly biblical, but it fits the theme. In fact, I think there was a song way back in the day, some of you may remember this, Que sera, sera. Now that I've been studying Spanish for long enough, I'm like, oh, I can translate that now. And it sounds like I'm trying to find an easy way out, doesn't it? Because that's a very kind of a lighthearted thing to say. It's like, oh, whatever. It's just going to be what it is. But it's not a cop-out. It's not some sort of fatalistic weakness. It's not passive appeasement. It's not even trying to absolve us of any responsibility, saying, well, that's just the way things are. No, to say whatever will be, is a deep expression of grace. And it is a profound strength of character that can only come from faith in God. But how? Because when we are controlled by our differences and our divisions, those become the things that power all of our behaviors. Those are the things then that control us. And so then we are always seeking to be in control so that our unique set of differences can be in power as opposed to someone else's, because I'm always right and you all are always wrong. You've been around me long enough to know that's not the case. If you aren't sure about that, talk to Emily. She can tell you that I'm pretty good at being wrong. But the trouble is when we're controlled by that, we are always seeking out that next source of power, that next set of differences that, and more importantly, if we are the ones that are in power, we're always seeking out that next sort of differences that we can remove, that we can take away. When control and power is determined by what makes one group different from another, then when that group that's in power runs out of people that are different from them, what do? Logic would dictate, well, you're no longer in control because there's no one different from you, right? Well, logic doesn't always work in the real world. The real world says, well, you just moved the goalposts. Now you just become different again. And we have history that tells us this. You go back into times of Jim Crow South, into times around the Civil War. There were folks that were carrying around cards that had skin tones on them to determine if just how much of a slave someone was, or how black they were. You go back to Germany circa World War II. They had all sorts of folks. They were always looking for another group of people that they could note and mark as being different from them. Even small differences can become incredibly important. But that's not what we're called to. Because Jesus is our King. We are instead called to family. But the fullest ideal of family, the kind of family that was created in the image of God, that is marked by what just a few verses earlier the writer of Colossians says, therefore as God's choice, holy and loved, put on compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Our passage out of Colossians this morning can be broken up into two sections, verses 12 to 17 and verses 18 to 25. The first part is just a whole bunch of verses that give us general directions like this. General directions on how to live. And the second tells us how that looks in different types of relationships that we will experience. We look at this list in verse 12, and the hard part of this list, you look at these characteristics, and the hard part of this is that those are all things that take time and practice. And time is a scarce resource in a world that is controlled by differences. Because when we have time, we find these things. Like if we have time and we don't actively have folks trying to divide us based on our differences, we naturally begin to find these things because that's who God made us to be. If we have time, we will get there, we will find those things because that's what God wanted for us. And because that's how God created us, it's why differences are always quick. They always want to move fast. In a world based on differences, you have to move fast because that's the only way that you can maintain control. To break out of that, we have to practice these things. We have to practice compassion and kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And we have the time and space to practice that because Jesus is our King, God is our Father, and He holds us in His hands. And no matter what else, we can take the time for this because no matter how special I was told I was growing up, I am not so special that the whole world is completely and totally dependent on me in this moment to do the thing, whatever the thing is. And in just 2 easy payments of $19.99, you too can have this exact same thing, right? We know how this goes. If I think that I am that special, if I think that it is that important, that is difference and division leading me away, and that's not God. This world is going to be what it is going to be. And the more that we try to control it because we think that we have the right answers, that my particular set of differences are right and correct, and everyone else is wrong, the more this world will always stay the same. Because it's that kind of living that got us into this mess in the first place. But living as if God has the whole world in his hands, that it is his world, that Jesus is king over, and we don't need to try and rule that world as the powers behind the throne. You go into some parts of the larger Christian community, you've got folks that are more than happy to acknowledge Jesus as king so long as they can sit in the background and pull the strings. That's not it either. That doesn't work either. But if we can let go of those things, then we can be different. And then we can have changes for the better. Go to the second part of this passage. This is where we get this rather infamous passage that I'm sure there were probably more than one of y'all that as Shelley was doing such a good job of reading that were beginning to cringe, going, "Ooh, preacher, you're gonna say that out loud in church?" Yeah, this is the wives submit to your husbands, children to your parents, slaves to your masters. The first thing to know about this passage is that it is very easy to use this to maintain the status quo. It's not the intent of the passage by any stretch of the imagination, but it's easy to use it for that purpose. All you have to do is just pay attention to the first part and ignore the rest of it. And you would think, well, but all the words are right there. How do you do that? Well, history tells us we do that very easily because we like the first part. It's the second part we don't particularly care for. The goal here is to draw us into something new and something different. So we have the first part of these statements in the one side, and the second part is the relationship that is there. So we add to that husbands and parents saying, hey, there's a relationship here that is important. Now, of note is that we don't have one for the slave. We'll come back to why that's important here in a second. We have that, and then we have the third part in here, because the writer of Colossians just knows, because apparently he knows people, he's met people, knows that we're going to struggle with this, that we're going to get caught up on the first part of it, and so he puts in this next part to make sure we all know that we do this because of God, so that it is appropriate in the Lord, that it pleases the Lord, that it is motivation for fearing the Lord. And this isn't God's permission to do whatever we want. This is a reminder saying your relationship is based in me, and that if I don't like it, I will lead you out. That's the rest of that passage that comes after these few verses. God says, I will lead you out of this if it is not good. Now, there is one part of this that's missing. There's a big gap in my bad little PowerPoint chart up here, and that is we have slaves and masters. You go back and look at that verse. The only time masters is ever mentioned there is just in reference to the slaves, so that we have a better idea of what they're talking about. And the point is that can never be a good relationship in a faithful life. Because there is no family there. There's no family in that relationship. But God says, endure. If you find yourself in that place, endure. But don't do it for your master as a people pleaser. And why not? Because all you're going to do is keep that cycle going, and nothing will ever change. Do it for me, and know that the evil will find their end. Basically, vengeance is not yours, but it is God's. And remember that no matter what, this is not the end. So where do we take all this from? Where do we take this? Excuse me. First, we start in kind of that last place. Now, most of us are never going to never find ourselves in position of being a slave, although the slave trade is still active and strong all across the world, including in the United States. The thing to know about that is that it is always illicit, and that it is always wrong. We may never find ourselves as a part of that, but we will sometimes find ourselves in a place where we cannot be fully in a family relationship with someone, where we can fully enter into that kind of place. And for that, the writer of Colossians tells us we have to endure, and if nothing else, focus on God and do whatever we have to for him so that we can get through it. For all other relationships, God tells us, remember that it is a relationship, that you come to this together, and that if one person has power over another person, that's okay, that's just the way things are. But remember that God is always with you, and that just because someone has lesser power, they are still deserving of right and good treatment because they are also a part of the family. This does not absolve us of responsibility, but makes it stronger. And all of this means that to do this well, we have to let go of the things that do not bring the family together. That means we have to let go of focusing on our differences, of gaining control based on division, and we have to work to strengthen each other and to build each other up. And we can't do that in a world that is driven by differences, because then it is a world that is driven by sin. But we remember that God has the whole world in his hands. And for that, we can stop and we can take a breath. And we can find something that is new. Something that builds the relationships that are so important, that can break us out of that cycle of control and of sin. And we remember that we live in God's grace. That we can't fix everything. And that everything isn't going to be just like we think it should be. Because I'm not always right all the time. I mean, I might hit 99% sometimes, but I'm not right all the time. And it's okay that things aren't always going to be just as we want. Because God has us. And instead, we work to live as he calls us. And that is what is most important. So let us go and live a life in this place, called by God, to live in the world that Christ is king of, a world that is held in his hands, to live a life that can be different from what we have seen, that can be better, that can break us out of that cycle of control and do something new. Let us live that life because Jesus is our King, and let us do that in his name. Amen.